Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Cadet First Class Gabe Yeoman. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our NCLS session featuring Dr. John Torres, U.S. Air Force Colonel, retired. Dr. Torres is a self-described Air Force brat who graduated from the U.S. Air Force Academy in 1982. His 32-year military career in the Air Force included active duty as a C-130 Hercules pilot and service in the Air National Guard and Air Force Reserve as a flight surgeon. His military service also included a tour of duty in Iraq in 2004, as well as rescue missions at the South Pole and in response to Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Rita. Leveraging his combined medical and military experience, Dr. Torres helped establish training courses for NATO Special Forces soldiers to ensure a high level of consistency across various nations, languages, and cultures. He currently teaches NATO Special Forces as a range of skills, including tactical combat casualty care, combat simulations, and medical leadership. Additionally, throughout his career, Dr. Torres has undertaken numerous humanitarian missions to Central and South America, providing medical care for children in need. Finally, Dr. Torres is the author of Dr. Disaster's Guide to Surviving Everything. Please join me in welcoming Dr. John Torres.
All right, good morning. Just real quick, just so I can get a lay of the land here and figure out who's who. How many people here are in the military? Pretty much everybody? How many people here went to military academies? Okay, a good deal of people here, because that's part of how I'm going to open up here. But like he mentioned there, I've done a variety of things in my life. I've done a variety of different career paths and careers that were disjointed and didn't make sense, but they all had common themes behind them. And one of the common themes is what I want to talk about. So when they asked me, what can you talk about that has to do with leadership, that was something that impacted your life, it took me a couple days to think about it. And then the reason it came up in my mind is because I was doing something and I messed up, and my wife asked me about something, and I went back to what I usually say, well, no excuse. And for those who went to military academies know exactly what that means. When you come here, one of the first things they teach you is your knee-jerk reaction to anything they blame you for is no excuse, sir, no excuse, ma'am. And you do that whether you did it or not. And there were times when I was sitting in my room, something would happen, we'd get called out in the hallway, I'm next to my roommate who messed up, they're blaming me, and my answer is no excuse, sir. And that did a couple things. One, I had to take the blame for it, which made me feel bad because I took the blame for something I didn't do. And two, my roommate felt bad because he couldn't say anything because he couldn't pipe up because he wasn't being talked to. At the time, I sat there going, this doesn't make sense. If I could just explain to you what happened, you'd understand. And for those who have been here know, that's not the way it works. You just take it. And it took me years to realize the reason you just take it is because no excuse, sir, is actually a different way of saying personal responsibility. You're taking responsibility for something. Whether you did it or not, you're taking responsibility, which later in life came up when I was doing a lot of leadership positions. Whether I did it or not, somebody who worked for me probably did it. Somebody who worked for me might have messed up. It's my fault that they messed up. So my answer is no excuse, sir. No excuse, ma'am. I'm responsible for it. I want to go back to a story. For those who have been to military academies, it's my first day here, and this is the first day I got the lesson on no excuse, sir. Personal responsibility. I was here, and we went in processing day one. And for those who have ever been to a military academy understands the trauma of processing day one. You come in here, your parents drop you off, in my case they did. You get separated from your parents. All of a sudden, you're not treated as nice as you were back home. You get yelled at a little bit, you get pushed around, you ran around a lot. Back then, this is in the 70s, I had pretty long hair coming out of high school. One of the first things they did, cut your hair off. And so a lot of these things are happening at the same time. And so you're feeling like, I'm missing home and it's only been 10 minutes. And so I want to make sure that I get to see my parents. Well, the academy did something which was interesting. In retrospect, maybe not the brightest thing to do, but it was interesting because it helped us out, is they let us go through all the in-processing. We got our uniforms, we got our haircuts, we got everything, got assigned to our squadrons, we were put in our rooms, and then we all came out and they let us go to the field house where our parents were waiting for us. And they'd been ushered throughout the day, and different things had happened to them throughout the day so they could basically do the tourism of the academy. And at the end of the day, they said, we're going to let you say goodbye to your parents. And so we got to spend some time with our parents. Well, they had an hour time frame that you could take the bus back to your dorm rooms. You knew what was going to happen once you got back to your dorm rooms, right? And so they basically started at the beginning of the hour and just had buses every 5 minutes. Well, I don't think it's anybody's surprise that at least 75% of the cadets waited for the last bus. It didn't work. And so they had to bring more buses and more buses. Well, the upperclassmen weren't very happy about all that. And so they came back. You know, as soon as we turned the corner, we started getting yelled at. We started getting the things that happened in basic training, which we knew, we were expecting. One of the problems is I wasn't very familiar with the academy because I'd been there for all of probably 3 hours. I came down a stairwell to get on the bus to go to the field house. They dropped everybody off at different stairwells, and you had to wait to your stairwell. They all looked exactly the same to me. So I got off on a stairwell, went up. I knew I had to go up like 3 flights of stairs. I went up 3 flights of stairs, and I'm sitting there, and we're all round in the corner. We're marching like we do march, and the upperclassmen are there. And one of the things you say is, I was in G Squadron, guts. One of the things you say is, you know, good afternoon, sir, guts. Good afternoon, sir, guts. Problem is, everybody in front of me is saying, good afternoon, sir, executioner. Good afternoon, sir, executioner. I was on the wrong floor. I was in the wrong squadron. For those who've been here know what that means. Not good. I had about 10 seconds to figure out what I was going to say. You know, the high school John Torres would have said, good afternoon, sir, executioner, and just kind of snuck in there and tried to figure out my way back. But we'd already had briefings about the honor code. We'd already had briefings about personal responsibility. So I said, you know, I got to do what I have to do. And so they, good afternoon, sir, executioner. Good afternoon, sir, executioner. Good afternoon, sir, guts. You could have heard a pin drop. I must have had 10 cadets on me, upperclassmen, yelling and screaming. What was I doing there? And I don't know if my feet even touched the ground, but I ended up going up and down stairwells and getting back to my squadron. Problem is, when I got back to my squadron, as we're rounding the corner, I can hear a lot of yelling. And all my classmates in Gut Squadron are in the hallway, in their shower robes, waiting to take showers, getting yelled at because they couldn't find me. My roommate was getting yelled at because he didn't know where I was. We'd only met for like 3 seconds. He didn't even know who I was. And so he's getting yelled at, and they're explaining to him that his one response is no excuse, sir. For some reason, it was his fault that I had done this. And he fell on the sword, he did it, and he did well. The purpose behind that story is that you learn from day one here to accept that personal responsibility. In his case, he was accepting the responsibility to take care of me. And you learn over the years, you take care of each other. And that's subsequently what happens as time goes on. But it was my opening story of the Air Force Academy, what happened here, and then of course throughout your freshman year, no excuse, sir, is a constant theme for anything you do, anytime you get yelled at. And it follows you once you get passed out of here. And for the cadets that are here, there's a lot of things you want to forget while you're here, that you say, you're never going to do this. It's kind of like being a parent. You know, you're always doing these things when you're a child of like, I'm never going to do what my mom or dad do. And then once you get a child, you realize you're doing the exact same thing your mom and dad did. Same thing here as a cadet. There's going to be things you fall back on as a cadet, and no excuse, sir, is one of those things you'd end up falling back on. Now, I want to walk you through my careers here and kind of talk about how that impacted each part of my career and differently. So first off, when I got out of here, I went to pilot training, and I was a pilot. I was assigned to C-130s, and I flew a Special Ops C-130, an EC-130, for a few years doing that. Did a lot of missions there, had a lot of fun, had a good time. Didn't quite understand the responsibilities we had because I was a second and first lieutenant at the time, but understood that we were doing a very important mission at the time and making sure that the world stayed at peace the way we wanted the world to stay at peace. And there were some conflicts that went on and some missions we went on that essentially showed that. And throughout this time period, everything was fine. I then switched off to C-21s, which is a Learjet, became an instructor pilot in that area. I was a pilot, so I thought I was pretty good. I thought, you know, top of the pyramid, I'm great, you know, things are good. I can do kind of anything I want, and I'm an instructor pilot, which means that I know even more. Well, as an instructor pilot, for some reason, one of the other instructor pilots got in their mind, and they had done some calculations. And remember, we're all engineers from the academy. They'd done some calculations that the plane could take more G's than we thought it could take, than it was said it could take. And so we decided we could do some maneuvers that weren't approved in the airplane. And so we all started doing these maneuvers when we were by ourselves. And I won't go too much into the detail, but eventually, one of the squadron commanders from a different squadron found out and rightly told our squadron commander. Next day, I'm in there in the squadron commander's office with the other instructor pilots, and we are just as at attention as we can get, just getting screamed at by our commander, and rightly so, because what we were doing was very dangerous, and if something had happened, we could have died. Somebody in the plane could have died with us, but more importantly, what we were doing as instructor pilots is we were telling the young pilots that this is okay to do. It's okay to do things like this. It's okay to skirt the rules and basically think you know more than the engineers who designed the plane, than the test pilots who tested the plane, than the Dash 1, for those who have flown know what that means, that the Dash 1 doesn't have all the answers in it and you can do other things. And so rightly so, at that moment in time, it again became a no excuse sir kind of thing, where I had to take personal responsibility. The word Article 15 was thrown around. They looked into it. Thankfully, they didn't do it, but it would not have been undeserved because of what we were doing at the time. Again, you learn these lessons in life of going, okay, I need to take the responsibility for this. I need to take a step back and realize what my actions do and how they do those things and how they can impact the people around me. So after flying for almost 8 years, I decided at the time that I wanted to become a doctor. And this is something that had been in my mind my whole life. And so I decided I'm going to go ahead and become a doctor. I'm going to go to medical school. Went to medical school down in Albuquerque, the University of New Mexico. Ended up doing my residency, University of New Mexico, in emergency medicine. One of the things about emergency medicine is you run a team. And the team you run is basically the equivalent of being on a team in the Air Force, where there are people that outrank you, there are people that you outrank, there are people that have to listen to you, there are people you have to listen to. But at the same time, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, I do a lot of teaching for Special Forces right now. It's a different dynamic on how teams work, and that's how it is in the emergency room too. And so one of the things you learn in the emergency room is you have to take information from everybody. And it could be myself, the doctor, giving the information. It could be the med tech giving me information. It could be a nurse giving me the information. It could be the computer programmer giving, whoever it is, you have to listen to all this information. At the same time, you have to take that personal responsibility of saying, I'm going to be the one that makes the final decision, and I'm going to be the one that lives by this decision. Now, the thing about being a doctor, especially being in the emergency room, is when you make these decisions, you're not the one living by these decisions. The patient is. And so the responsibility you have there is to the patient and perhaps more importantly to the patient's family. And there were many times in the emergency room where I had to go talk to a patient's family and give them the worst news they've ever heard in their life. And I knew that at that moment in time, their life was changing based on what I said. And so you learn that there are certain things you say, there are certain things you don't say, there's certain information you give, there's certain information you don't give, and you try to make it as easy of a fall as possible, but at the same time, you are talking to them about things you did, and one of the big questions they always have is, whether they ask it or not, did you do everything you could have done? That's the personal responsibility part. And so I had to be able to look in the mirror, I had to be able to stare them in the face, look them in the eyes and say, we did everything we could. We did everything we could. We fought as hard as we could to save your loved ones. And it just, in this instance, unfortunately, it didn't work. And you had to be able to get them to understand that. You yourself had to understand that. But at the same time, you had to take the responsibility for, if things didn't work, why didn't they work? And what happened to them was because of things you may or may not have done. And so again, that personal responsibility, that no excuse sir part of things comes into play. And so I did that for many, many, many years. 20 years in the emergency room, working with patients in a variety of emergency rooms, and for those who understand hospital systems, all the way up to level 1 trauma centers for many years, which is the height of the trauma center scene where you get the shootings and the stabbings and all that. Same time, the professionalism kicks in where you have to take care of patients you might not want to take care of, patients who might have done something that you don't necessarily agree with for whatever reasons, but you have to treat it very professionally. And again, you have to be able, at the end of the day, to say, no excuse, sir, I'm responsible for what happened there. I'm responsible for everything I did and my team did, and hopefully we had a good outcome. Now, pushing beyond that career, my next career, and the joke in my family is I have this 7-year career path, so every 7 years I tend to go through different careers. My next career was into TV. And for those who may or may not have seen me, was the NBC News correspondent. Now I'm an NBC News contributor, which basically means I went from full-time to part-time. And so for 7 years, I was full-time NBC News correspondent. I was their TV doctor. And I was the person on TV who would give out all the health information. When I first went there, and I interviewed for the job, one of the things I told them is, I'm only going to say things that have a scientific basis to them. I'm only going to say things that I believe are true, understanding that truth might change. And as we found out during the pandemic, that truth changed constantly. And it's not because we lied the first time, it's because the truth changed because science changes and science is messy. And so I told them, I'm going to try to make the best effort I can to get that across to people that are listening to me. At the same time, I understand this is a huge public health forum that I have here. We're talking 10 million people are watching me when I'm on TV, and there's 10 million people that are listening to my words. And sure, I do understand that a lot of people are sitting there and they're going to second guess what I say, which is great, because they need to go in and check it in more details. You never want to just rely on one source. But at the same time, I do know there was a contingent of people, a certain percentage, that I could say something and they would follow that advice. I could tell people on air to stop taking their blood pressure medicine, and they would stop taking their blood pressure medicine without asking their doc. I knew that. I knew there were a certain number of people, thankfully a low number, that would do that. So I made it very clear that I was going to take responsibility for everything I said on air, that I was going to take responsibility for everything I did on air, and if I said something that was erroneous, which does happen a couple times, that I would come back and say, hey, I messed up. Here's the actual information. I didn't get all the information when I first went on there because sometimes things move hot and heavy. Well, during the pandemic, this came to fruition because in the pandemic, for those 3 years, I was on constantly. And my claim to fame is there was one day where I was on 27 different times on 5 different pandemic-related topics. And this is when the vaccines were getting approved. This is when the medicines were coming out. This is when the virus was changing. And so all this information, trying to get all the information out there in a way that people could understand, but also a way that they could trust, I understood that was something that was a mandate that I had given myself and a mandate that I told NBC that I was going to stick with. And so thankfully, we got through the pandemic and things are much better now, but at the same time, I understand that even now as a medical contributor, I need to be responsible for what I say. There's no excuse here for what I say. It has to be something that I believe in, that I understand, and it has scientifically sound. So that's career number, I think, 3. The other one I'm doing now, which is very interesting, and it really highlights what's happening here with this topic, is since 2010, I've been teaching NATO Special Forces. It started off in 2010. A bunch of us got together and we said, what is happening with NATO Special Forces medics? And for those who understand the medic role in different Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Space Force, the different medic roles, you understand they're varied and they're very different. Well, with Special Forces, it even takes on a different variation. And with Special Forces, the medic is almost like a paramedic. They're out there by themselves. They're in austere environments where they might be out there for a couple weeks getting no support because they can't make any callbacks, and they have to be able to do this. These are very highly leveled, highly trained medics. And one of the things about them is, number one, they're very intelligent. Number two, they're very highly trained. And number 3, and this is where I learned a big lesson, is they all take personal responsibility for what they do. And you will literally hear from them, why did you do this? No excuse. You will literally hear that coming out of their mouth, whether it's, and we're talking NATO, the 30 plus nations of NATO out there, each and every one of them, because they all go through a selection process. It's very hard to get into Special Forces. It's hard to get into Special Forces as a medic because in Special Forces, you're not just, as opposed to the regular military, as opposed to regular civilian life, you're not just a medical person who does medical things and follows all the medical ethics. You're an operator medic, which means first you are what they call a shooter. You're somebody that's on a Special Forces team that is responsible for going in and doing these direct actions, these special reconnaissance, these military assistance missions. But your additional job, much like there'll be an operator communications person. Their additional job is communications. There'll be an operator medic, and their additional job is being a medic. And so they have to be able to essentially look at those two things and say, one, I have to take care of the patients, but two, I'm here on a role as an operator. I'm here as a role on the team, and these are 6 to 8 man teams of making sure that my teammates are taken care of or getting the mission accomplished. These people, the men and women that are in these special forces, are phenomenal. And again, they taught me the lesson even more so about the no excuse or the personal responsibility that they have to take. Because there are certain things in special forces that they go through. And one of them is understanding what special forces is. And in special forces, they have certain essentially rules of special forces. And one of them is that special forces can't be done after an emergency occurs. It has to be done beforehand. And so these guys go through many, many, many months of training. The Special Forces medics typically, especially if they're what's called a SOCM, which is a Special Operations medic, they go through about 18 months of training, just medical training. At the same time, they're doing their Special Forces training, they're shooting and everything else. And so, again, they have to go through a lot of training to get to the medical level. They have to sustain the medical level, and at the same time, they have to do the operational level part of it, which is very difficult for anybody who's been in the military to try and delineate between the medical and the operational aspect of things. And so these people, when they go on their missions, they know that whatever they do could impact not just the team, but could impact the mission. And by impacting the mission, these Special Forces missions, and the reason they're so important is because these Special Forces missions have what we call very high strategic implications. It could be, the prime example, getting Osama bin Laden. The prime example there, huge strategic implications. If that had failed, if other things had gone wrong, that could have had huge issues worldwide and in the United States. And so again, these are the folks that are out there. These are the folks that are on the line. And these are the folks that on a monthly basis I'm teaching about not just their profession, not just the medicine part of things, but also the planning part of things and the understanding that, hey, when something goes wrong, they're the ones that have to take that personal responsibility for making sure that, number one, if they have to do it again, they understand what went wrong, and number two, that at the time, they can make sure that they have what they need, including the knowledge to get things done. Now, one of the interesting things is I do a lot of simulation training with these men and women, and it's interesting because if you train simulations for anybody in the civilian world, and most people in the medical world, one of the most important aspects is debriefing. It's the same for Special Forces. In debriefing, one of the biggest aspects is trying to get an understanding of why something went wrong during the simulation. Because if you can fix their mindset in the simulation as to why they did something that wasn't necessarily correct, then you can at least get to the basis of that and hopefully change that so they do it right the next time. They understand why it's going on, and not just the knee-jerk reaction of switching things, but the understanding of why they need to switch things and why things need to be a little bit different. Again, that's the civilian world and the major military world. With Special Forces, it's different. These gentlemen and women are used to just saying, hey, it's my fault. It's my fault. I did it. It's my responsibility. Why did that happen? It's my responsibility. It's my fault. And so you have to break through that. And part of that breakthrough process is understanding why they are saying that and understanding, yes, it is your personal responsibility to do this, but let's try and ensure that we can get this to an understanding level so we can understand why you did this and fix it so that next time you don't have to worry about this so much and you can take care of the people you're with on your team. So one of the things through life, again, that has really, really impacted my life was that day one, that sitting there going, getting in the wrong area, getting in executioners when I'm a gut guy, going off, wrong place, making that decision to say, okay, I'm going to go ahead and do what I'm supposed to do and tell them I'm a guts person, and all of a sudden getting back there, seeing my roommate going through that, and essentially saying, okay, I need to take this responsibility myself. And then as time went on, especially your first year here, when every other word is no excuse, sir, no excuse, ma'am, because you're constantly getting asked questions, or at least you did back in the day, about why something happened. Anytime they ask a question, why did you do that? No excuse, which again led to that personal responsibility. And so as a military person, definitely. As a civilian person, definitely. As a medical person, definitely. That personal responsibility is very, very important. And understanding why you need to say, this is my responsibility, this is something I need to take care of, this is something I need to do, let me take care of this. And if you can do that to the point where people believe in you, then it stops there. They know you're going to take care of it. They trust you, which is an important aspect to a lot of things, not just the military, but a lot of things in leadership of saying, okay, this person can take care of it. And we've all been there. We've all been with leaders who say, it wasn't my fault. They did it. Somebody else was responsible for it. I'm going to fire somebody because they did the wrong thing. You know, something happened and it's their fault. Just that scapegoat person. That's easy to do. As a leader, you need to make sure that you don't do that. You need to make sure that you are taking the responsibility for the things that your team does and that you are fixing those things. Not just taking the responsibility, that's the easy part of it. That's the 10% part of it. The 90% is fixing what went wrong, and so that way they can deal with it in the future and move forward. And that'll do a couple things. Number one, it'll fix the problem, which is great. Number two, it'll continue to fix the problem as time goes on. And then number three, it'll give you that responsibility, it'll give you that look in the people you work for eyes of saying, this is somebody we can trust. The flip side to this coin is also expecting these same things from the people you work for. And so it's easy to say, no excuse, sir, no excuse, ma'am, and say, you know, I'm the one that's going to take the fall for this one. That's the easy part of the thing. The hard part is going up to them and saying, hey, listen, this is something you did. I'm taking responsibility for it because I'm the head of this unit. I'm the head of the squadron. I'm the head of the wing. I'm the head of whatever. At the same time, you need to take responsibility for it because this is something you did. And so we need to fix it, we need to correct it, we need to make sure it doesn't happen again. And working that angle of saying, not only do I expect you to look at me as a person who you expect certain responsibilities out of, at the same time, I'm looking at you as somebody I expect certain responsibilities out of. And part of that is, I don't want a bunch of excuses. I don't want a bunch of excuses of why it happened, why somebody else did something, why it's not my fault. I want you to just tell me, yes, it happened. Yes, it's my fault, could be partially, and yes, I'm going to fix it. Here's how I'm going to fix it. It's not going to happen again. And if you can do that, regardless of where you are, regardless of what field you're in, you're going to be one step ahead of a lot of other people because things are going to get changed, things are going to work better, things are going to get done, and people are going to believe in you, which is one of the most important aspects you can have out there as a leader, is making sure that people believe in you and believe in what you do. And so, again, when you're here at the academy as a cadet, it didn't make sense. People were yelling at me. My roommate, somebody in my squadron would have done something. I know full well they did it. Yet at the same time, I have to take responsibility for it. I have to tell them, no excuse. Why did you do this? No excuse. And I'm just sitting here going, it's not my fault, but I'm going to go ahead and take the hit for this. And the no excuse part tries to get rid of what we always did as children. And I think every one of us did this. You know, that's the lamp you broke as you were playing around, and then you barely pieced the lamp back together. So hopefully your sister comes by and brushes it, knocks the lamp down, and your parents yell at your sister, and you're like, I saw her hit the lamp. You know, so it's one of those things, again, that we have to get past that childhood impulse of saying, you know, pointing fingers and saying somebody else did it, because as the saying goes, every finger you point, there's 3 more pointing back at you. So you have to make sure that you take responsibility for those things. Those things might not always be something that you did yourself, but there's something that you are possibly responsible for. And as a leader, you're definitely responsible for. And you need to make sure that you take care of it. So again, no excuses, sir. No excuse, ma'am. Anybody have any questions?
Thank you, Dr. Torres. At this time, I would like to open the floor for questions. Attendees, please feel free to use the mics, the microphones posted around the audience. Please introduce yourself, where you hail from, and go ahead, feel free to ask. Thank you all.
Morning, Doctor. Kevin Baldwin, community member and Marine Corps veteran. Operator syndrome, TBIs, CTEs, the firefighter, the student athlete. As a medical professional, can you speak to effective and innovative treatment modalities for repeated brain injuries? Because part of personal responsibility is mental well-being.
And that's part of the responsibility, is making sure you take care of the people that you're working with and understand not just what's happening now, not just what's happening while they're doing their operation, but also what's happening beyond that. And we do a very good job in the military, especially in the medical military community, of taking care of them for the next few weeks or few months. Problem comes in next few years, next few decades. What happens at that point? And you are correct, you know, TBIs, traumatic brain injuries, the PTSD, all these things are issues that are still plaguing us and we're still trying to understand. CTE is a big thing that we're still doing a lot of research in. And there's a lot of innovation right now going on. And I do want to caution people because there's a lot of innovation going on, particularly with PTSD and other issues relating to TBIs with different hallucinogens, ketamine, psilocybin, these types of medications that are having great effects in clinical trials and now are getting out into the therapeutics in the world. But having done an interview with one of the experts in this, what she told me is, she said, the one caution I want to give you is people should not be doing this on their own. And the reason they should not be doing this on their own is because these medications, what they do is they open up doors of things that you as a person suffering from PTSD or other issues like this could not possibly open up because your brain is just keeping it shut. You have to have a therapist with you who, once those doors are open, can talk to you about what that means and how we can make it better by discussing this. If the doors just open by themselves and you're in a room because somebody gave you psilocybin or ketamine, that can cause things to become much, much, much worse. And so we're getting better, we're learning more. Things are slow, but that's the way research works. And as I mentioned earlier, science is messy, and that's the way research works. We want to make sure that things are safe, and that's where we are right now.
Thanks, Doctor.
Good morning, Dr. Torres. I'm Cadet 3rd Class Elizabeth Nimblett from Detachment 14, University of West Florida. So you mentioned getting over childhood pointing fingers. So how would you recommend getting over the pride of knowing where you came from and what you've been through for, say, like in the emergency room? So how would you get over that pride and don't point the finger in that situation?
Yeah, and that's one of the hardest things to do is getting over your own, the things you grew up with, which you want to keep the vast majority of those because that's our background, that's our heritage, that's what we grew up with. At the same time, there are certain things that you kind of need to let go and grow beyond. And part of that is through experiences of seeing it time after time. Part of that is through mentorship, of picking somebody that you believe in and you can see and you want to be like that person. And that's what I've done throughout my careers is finding somebody, I want to be like that person, and then trying to either be like them or surpass where they are right now, and then also becoming that leader, becoming that mentor. And there is truth in the fact that once you start teaching things, you have to know it a lot better than you did when you were doing things, because they're going to be asking questions. And that's what I'm finding in Special Forces in particular, is these men and women are very, very, very smart. And so they will ask us questions on why something happened. Why are we doing it this way? Well, last year we did it this way. And you have to have these answers cold. You have to know these things. And so part of that is, you know, the educational intelligence aspect of why science is saying things are a certain way. And the other part is the emotional aspect of why are we doing things in this particular way. And the best example I can give you, I do a lot of debriefings for simulations. And different countries debrief different ways. And we're trying to get the countries to all debrief in a like fashion, and we learned after years that that doesn't necessarily work, so we have to adjust it per country. And that's not a fault of theirs, that's just the way they are culturally in their background, so you have to incorporate that as well. No.
Thank you, sir.
All right.
Good morning, Colonel Torres, Cadet Brown, Detachment 280, University of Kansas. As leaders, many decisions cannot be purely made based on fact, but rather a gut instinct. When do you determine when it's appropriate to act subjectively versus objectively in time-sensitive situations?
So when you're doing something, and again, from being a pilot to being an ER doctor to even being, training these NATO Special Forces and being on TV where they'll ask you a question that you have to answer and you know your answer is going out to the airwaves and again, 10 million people are going to be listening to you. Oftentimes they'll ask you about, what does science show behind this? And then they'll switch to a question of, well, how do you feel about that? So that's going from the objective to the subjective very, very quickly. What I can tell you is if you're going to the subjective lane, you just need to essentially stick with your beliefs, stick with your guns, but also at the same time understand that not everybody thinks the same way you do. You might represent 50% of the people in your profession, in your country, in your region, in whatever, but there's that 50% out there, or whatever percentages you want to use, that think differently. And understanding, putting yourselves in their shoes a little bit, and like, how would they be looking at this? How would they perceive this? And never getting to the point where you believe that your subjective beliefs are the only beliefs out there. And that's what kept me out of a lot of problems during the pandemic that other TB doctors got into, is essentially going, okay, I'm going to stick with things that are scientific. If I go subjective, I'm going to tell them, number one, this is my opinion, and I understand your opinion could be different. And number two, that if science shows me things change, my mindset's going to change at the same time. When you're in an emergency room, it's a little bit different, or when you're flying and you have these things happen very quickly, then you have to look at, okay, here's what I know scientifically, here's what I trained in, but here's what I learned over the few years, and I'm going to adapt. And that adaptation is very important, but you have to have a certain skill level and a certain knowledge to be able to do that as quickly as you possibly can while you're taking care of somebody who potentially is dying in front of you.
Good morning, sir. Daniel Riley.
Did that answer your question?
Yes, sir.
All right, thanks.
Good morning, sir. Daniel Riley, Loyola University of Maryland. My question is, how did you balance institutional failures within your emergency department with a no excuses mindset when it came to negative patient outcomes?
So say it again, how do you
balance institutional failures within your emergency department with a no excuses, sir mindset when it came to negative patient outcomes?
So two things. One is that no excuses mindset is when you're leading your team and you're dealing with your team and you're making sure that your team members understand, I'm responsible for this. When you go higher up, and I thank you for asking this question, because when you start going into these positions of there's something happening at my institution, at my emergency room, there's something happening at the hospital that needs to be taken care of, then that's when you start fighting the fights and you start pushing them for the no excuses. You need to take responsibility for this. You need to fix this as the CEO of the hospital, as the head of this organization, as the general, as whoever it is. You need to take care of this because there should be no excuses coming from your job and your profession and your leadership position right now. And so, again, you don't want to be the person that just sits there and just complacently says, we'll do whatever you want us to do even though it's not working. You want to fight for your team. And so part of that personal responsibility is, again, not just falling on your sword for your team, but fighting for your team and going up to that level and realizing that that might get you in trouble. And if it does, well, number one, you're going to look great in the eyes of your team, but number two, you're going to be able to look in the mirror and sleep better at night. So,
Thank you, sir.
you bet.
Good morning, sir. My name is Cadet Maximus Ankra, hailing from the Virginia Military Institute. With all these careers that you've been through, being an instructor pilot, a doctor, news correspondent, all these roles of service, what was your personal motivation for always being in a position to help others?
Yeah, it's going to sound weird. I wanted to have fun. and to me, fun changed. And so I had fun. Every one of these jobs I did, I had a lot of fun doing it. I think I was doing a lot of good, and I think I was helping out a lot. And these were all positions where I always felt like I was giving something back, which has been important to me. But at the same time, it was something that, in my family, we always call ourselves Team Fun, because we always try to have fun, and I try to instill that in my children of whatever you're doing, make sure it's something you love. And that's a cliche, and a lot of people say that. But at the same time, when I moved from pilot to doctor to TV to teaching NATO Special Forces, I've had fun doing all those. And I always try to make that a basis for what I'm doing. And if I can do that, then I can, again, take this personal responsibility for making sure I take those extra steps. And one of the funny things is anytime I'm doing these lessons or giving these talks, I always tell people, I'm just winging it. I'm just kind of throwing it out there. I'm just top of my head kind of stuff. And my wife is always behind me going, you're lying to people, because I see you 3 days before going through notes and looking at things and everything, so your winging is very calibrated. And it's because I have fun doing this.
Dr. Torres, we have time for one more question.
One more question?
Good morning, Dr. Torres. My name is Mackenzie Monier. I'm a cadet at Det 220, Purdue University. My question is, when you're working in that chain of command and you have every step taking that no excuse mentality and taking responsibility for their actions, the inactions of those below you, how do you kind of take that person first leadership and integrate that to find when there is something going on in somebody's personal life and trying to encourage them to push aside that no excuse mentality to express personal issues and to trust their teammates?
Great question. And the no excuse mentality comes in to basically break through that ice of, pointing fingers and blaming everybody else and just saying, okay, let's start off here. I'm going to take responsibility for this. No excuse, sir. No excuse, ma'am. Great. As your commander, I appreciate you took responsibility for this. How are we going to fix it? Here's how we're going to fix it, sir. Perfect. I love it. Why did it happen? And that why did it happen is the most important part of this whole thing. It's kind of like the debriefings I talked about with the NATO Special Forces medics in simulations. Why did that happen is the most important aspect of this. And start digging down into that. And they have a thing called the 5 whys or the 7 whys. Why did you do that? Why did it happen? Why you just keep going down that ladder? That gets a little tedious and monotonous to the person answering the question. So basically just asking the question. What was going through your mind? Explain to me why you did this the way you did it, or explain to me why your team did this the way you did it, why you made this decision, and then even asking the blatant question. Is everything else going okay? Anything else you want to talk about? And we have noticed that, perhaps things aren't going as well at home as they could have been. Is there anything you want to talk about there? Understanding it's their personal space, and you don't want to get too far into their personal space without them saying it's okay to do that. But basically incorporating and balancing those two with one, I want you to take personal responsibility, but at the same time, let's try and figure out why this happened.
Thank you, sir.
Dr. Torres, on behalf of the United States Air Force Academy International Character and Leadership Symposium, thank you for sharing your experiences and enriching our understanding of warfighters to win.
All right, thank you guys. Appreciate it. All right, thank you.
This concludes our speaker session.